Okay, hi, I'm Sue Morosky from Presque Isle Audubon. I'll be the moderator for this presentation, and thank you for joining us. We're going to ask that everybody keep their audio and their video muted during the presentation, then you can turn them both on afterwards. And if you have any questions or comments, if you could put them in the chat box, and we'll stay on this meeting as long as it takes to answer all your questions. Okay, Lee, you're next.
Very good. Thanks, Susan. And I have the benefit of just doing a few of the introductory slides. This is the slide you saw as you entered into the chat. You'll see who the Pennsylvania Audubon Council Renewable Energy Committee members are, coming from several chapters across the state. You'll also see the authors of the document that is not publicly released, but it is accessed through the link that was provided in the drummer that was in November, and again in a reminder early on in December. So that was kind of restricted to our Audubon family, primarily, that it was intended for all of you. If you've had a chance to take a look at it, if you didn't, you can certainly go back, and that link is still active, but the document is not on the website. You will not find it where it could be accessed publicly. And the reason for that is this evening's PowerPoint is really a review of that document. And it's really an opportunity where we want our chapter leaders, those of you that are on board this evening, to have the opportunity to offer feedback this evening, and then potentially some feedback as we want to prepare the document for final input from our Audubon network, from our chapters, and then be able to publish it and provide it to other audiences and release it publicly. So next slide. The Renewable Energy Committee started out as the Renewable Energy Working Group and then became a part of the council as a committee. They've been at work for well over 2 years to create just this document that's focused on a utility scale solar, but they're also going to be focused on the range of renewable energy that we need to be concerned about in terms of addressing climate change and doing it in a way that is minimizes the impact on birds and other wildlife. Next slide. We can go to the next slide if you can, Susan. There we go. We know, and I think many of you were part of our effort to identify the conservation issues of high priority for the chapters across Pennsylvania. Climate came up as one of the high priority concerns. So we all know why. We know that we need to address climate change in a big way, and that renewable energy is a major component of making sure that the temperature, average world temperature rise stays at 1.5 degrees Celsius or below. If it goes beyond that, we have a huge issue and implications for extinction for many of the birds we love, or the endangerment of a lot of birds we love. So this is at the center of what this group has done. And we know that it is a bottom line to save birds. The next slide. And then here's the document goal. And this is really important for the chapter network. You're going to learn in this municipality, as you probably already know, that Pennsylvania is a home rule state. The siting of these kinds of facilities is done on a municipal basis, a municipality or by county basis. It is not something that can be done statewide with a magic wand. So it's really taking the chapter network and the vigilance that they can offer to see what's going on in the municipalities in each of your chapter territories or nearby in your part of the state, to be able to make sure that projects that are being proposed meet some of the guidelines that are going to be outlined tonight. And with that, I'm going to give you a bit of an outline of the document itself by turning it over to Judy Stepanovsky, co-chair of the committee and also one of the primary authors of the paper. Judy?
Thank you, Lee. one thing I want to mention briefly is if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll have a period at the end of the program to answer questions on. So, and we'll stay on as long as we need to, if you do have questions that you want answered. Okay, now this slide shows the table of contents, and the reason we put this in here is to give you an idea of what is included in our document. It's a lengthy document, it's 50 pages, and it goes pretty in depth about a lot of the aspects of utility scale solar power. When we talk about utility scale solar, we're talking about large plots, maybe from several hundred acres to several thousand acres. Oftentimes what developers will do will be put together a lot of little farms or other areas, put these plots together and include them in one big proposal. And as Laura will mention, the municipality won't know anything about it until they're submitting it to PJM, but more about that later. I'll talk in general about renewable energy and utility scale solar. Laura will discuss utility scale solar permitting in Pennsylvania and municipal authority. And Tom Kuhl will talk about other items to be included in a utility scale solar ordinance. On the right-hand side, you see the appendices. And these are in-depth looks at the sources that we used for our guidelines and recommendations. I just want to mention Appendix B, Penn State Extension. They have many great webinars about renewable energy and in particular about utility scale solar. There's a lot there about farms and utility scale solar. Also a lot about best practices. Next slide, please. Okay, beyond carbon free. This is one of the documents referenced in our guidelines. And this is put together by Level 10 Energy with the National Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy. And they're looking at purpose-led renewable energy, not just developing it everywhere, but having a template of what to go, what to do, where to go for the best environmental impacts. They talk about 3 different principles: community, engage early and often; conservation, you want to avoid and minimize impacts to wildlife, habitat, and natural areas; and environment. Along with avoiding certain habitats, you also want to avoid development that releases carbon stored in forests. You don't want to cut down a forest to put in solar panels. And wetlands and grasslands also release carbon. There's carbon that's stored in the soil layer, and all that gets destroyed and destroyed when you develop grasslands. Next slide, please. Okay, some additional recommendations from this document. First of all, avoid prime farmland. Prime farmland is what's designated, the designation for the best farmland, the best physical, chemical characteristics in the soil, the best moisture characteristics, also adequate rain, and farmland that really is the best farmland for growing crops, also for growing feedstock and for foraging animals. What we want to do instead is look for low quality soil, preferably without trees and vegetation. But we'll be talking about that a little bit more later. Avoid migratory flyways, including ridge tops and stopovers such as wetlands, grasslands, forests, conservation areas, and lakes. These are all very important for birds. You want to prevent habitat fragmentation, particularly for forests in Pennsylvania. That's a real big issue. Reduce degradation of habitat from construction of roads. You keep all that to a minimum. Avoid soil compaction and erosion and generation of road dust. Also, You want to prevent the introduction of invasive plants from vehicles, mower blades, tires. So one way of doing that is if you do have to clear an area, you immediately want to replant it with native vegetation before invasives have a chance to come in and get established. Next slide. Okay, transmission lines. And a lot of this applies to other types of renewable energy, not just utility scale solar, but we know that transmission lines kill millions of birds each year, and that's just in the US alone. First of all, through collisions, the birds don't see the lines, and electrocutions of the larger birds. Transmission lines also cause habitat destruction if they're placed in sensitive areas in flight paths and stopover destination. So what you want to do for all types of renewable energy, first of all, you want to site it as close to users as possible to minimize bird deaths and reduce the loss of energy that occurs along the transmission line. And unfortunately, what's happening is most of these projects are being placed in rural areas and not being placed near the urban centers of population. But in addition to this major development in rural areas, we're also getting, many of these areas don't have transmission line infrastructure. So besides the problems we already have with transmission lines, we're creating millions and millions of miles more of transmission lines with the renewable energy projects. If you have to put new transmission lines, ideally you want to place them underground if you can, and if not, there are things that can be done to make the lines safe and the transmission, the towers, the poles that raptors land on. And this doesn't just happen in Western US. About 2 years ago, it happened here right outside of Philadelphia, Montgomery County. There was a local eagle nest on preserved farmland, and the female eagle was electrocuted when she landed on a transmission pole, and you know, it was between the Schuylkill River and their nest site, and that had, the male has a new mate, but that pair hasn't been successful since. Next slide, please. Responsible siting and design. There's a number of things that you want to do when you're siting and designing your solar project. First of all, prior to installation, you want to plant native, either leave the vegetation in place or plant native grasses and pollinator plants under and around where the solar panels will go. Ideally, you want to plant these in the year prior to installing your solar panels to give these plants and grasses a chance to get established. You want to put native plant buffers around the panels, also between the rows of panels, and ideally underneath the panels. Wildlife friendly fencing is another feature it's important to incorporate, and there's a lot of research going on about this, but there's several ways to do it. One way is to install a fence of a certain gauge that is, here comes my kitty, she's walking on my table. I gotta move her off of this, excuse me. Anyway, there's several ways to do this. You have a fence gauge that's big enough to allow birds and small animals to pass through. Sometimes at the bottom of the fence, it's lifted up. There's openings at the bottom to allow these animals to pass through, but it's also important to create wildlife corridors, especially if a solar project is disrupting a big habitat area. What you want to do is allow safe passage for the animals that used to roam through this habitat. And this corridor would not be fenced, and you'd also want to plant shrubbery vegetation to provide cover for the animals. What you don't want to do is just fence everything off and dump the animals that used to pass through here right on a roadway.
Yeah.
When you're looking at sites, you really want to avoid tree cutting and clearance of forested land. If you do have to cut trees, you want to compensate for this by acquisition and preservation of forested lands elsewhere. Next slide. Low impact solar. This is this is one of the names given to environmentally friendly solar. And the Inspire research at the bottom, this is a part of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, part of the Energy Department, and they have great information on their website about this. When we're talking about low impact solar, we don't want to just use the site for power generation. We also want to have pluses that go along with it. Native vegetation, pollinator habitat, solar integrated greenhouses, co-location of agriculture, sheep grazing, and beekeeping. These are just some of the things that you can do on a solar site. Next. Some of the benefits. Low impact solar, you leave the topsoil in place. There's minimal, if any, land grading and no gravel. What's done now for the most part is developers will clear the land, grade it, cover it with gravel, and that results in 100% stormwater runoff. With low impact solar, you either leave the existing vegetation intact or replace it with native vegetation or crops. And doing so, all of this improves soil health and water retention, reduces stormwater runoff. Decommissioning costs are greatly reduced. The average lifespan of a solar farm is about 25 years. And I shouldn't call that solar farm. That's an industry term, but it's not really accurate. If you do low impact solar, the land can easily be returned to farming or a natural area. And it can also be responsive to community priorities and is often more acceptable by local communities. Next. This is a drawing from Inspire. They're showing you what solar panels collecting the runoff, creating habitat for pollinators, allowing distribution of the available water, and also using the solar panels to provide shade and reduce thermal and radiation stress. Next. Okay, here's two examples that I found in Pennsylvania. Both of these I found on my way on different routes to get to Wagner's Gap Hawkwatch. This first one is outside the Wilson Elementary School in Carlisle. And up on the left, you can see that the solar farm. And what they have grazing around the outside is sheep. So instead of bringing in mowers, this is habitat for sheep growing. One bad thing about this project is it looks like they've kind of just let the weeds grow up, and there's no planting underneath the panels. You can see that it's a little bit hard to see on the right, but at the top you can see gravel underneath the panels, and that's something you really don't want to do. But this is an improvement. Next slide. Okay, this is also in Carlisle, and this is the land right next to the headquarters of the giant food stores. And for those that aren't familiar with this is a grocery store chain in southeastern and I guess south central Pennsylvania. And next to their corporate headquarters, on the left, you can see the solar array. They have a pollinator field next to the solar array, and they have beehives. And here's a close-up of the solar array. And what you can see is they've got pollinators planting around as a buffer on the outside of the solar array. They don't seem to have too many plants in between, but there's no gravel there. So that's a good thing. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Laura Jackson. Next slide.
Thank you, Judy. To give everyone an idea of the sense of scale of solar projects in Pennsylvania, we looked at the PJM website, and PJM basically controls the grid in Pennsylvania and in 12 other states. And so just for Pennsylvania, as of December the 3rd, there were 15 projects in service, and these are utility scale solar, totaling about 1,600 acres. Currently, there are 12 projects under construction, which equal about 2,500 acres. And there's an amazing 653 active projects in the queue. And that means PJM is studying them to see if they are feasible. And that equals almost 51,000 acres of solar development. No doubt some of those will not be developed, but it's still an astonishing amount of land. Now, most of this, like Judy said, is occurring in rural Pennsylvania on farmland, but some of it's also going into areas that was forested. We would suggest that abandoned mine lands and brownfields could then be called bright fields if solar development occurs in those, as well as on landfills and industrial sites. And we don't address rooftop solar in this document, but we certainly support parking lot, warehouse rooftops, and of course, homes for rooftop solar. Next. So here's an example in Clinton County. If you look at the top left-hand picture, that's part of a map of Pennsylvania. You can see St. Mary's to the left, and then that outline of blocks is Clinton County. And that orange area is where there's a proposed, actually an in progress, solar and natural gas project going on. So I looked at Google Earth. If you go to the top right-hand corner, this was in April 2021, and I drew a polygon around the areas that were leased. And this is over 3,000 acres for 25 years. And you can see that it's almost all intact forest. And remember, this is what Audubon considers Pennsylvania's songbird nursery to be, because we have so much intact forest in the northern tier. But unfortunately, if you look down in the bottom left-hand corner, in the winter of 2021, they started logging this area. And one reason it is attractive, you can't really tell very well, but there are some big transmission lines very close to this area. So then I looked at Google Earth in June of 2022. Again, there's that same polygon, but you can see all the cleared areas. You can see the roads, maybe some well pads. I'm not sure exactly what all, but you can definitely tell that the forest has been cleared. And by the time they're done, they anticipate logging over 2,000 acres of intact forest, which is most unfortunate because there's a carbon penalty involved as well as habitat fragmentation. Next slide. So we recommend some areas that should be protected from solar development. Public lands such as state or federal or local, historic structures and areas that are listed in the National Register of Historic Places or eligible to be listed, and also on state registers. We certainly would want to protect Audubon important bird areas, conserved lands which are listed, and areas of special value. And like Judy mentioned, prime farmland, and also farms and agricultural protection zones. All of these areas we feel would be better preserved as they are instead of developed. Next slide. So how is it regulated in Pennsylvania? Well, like Lee said, we're a home rule state, but the Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code does give certain regulations and certain types of basically guidelines that are regulatory eventually, that authorize municipalities to regulate solar to a certain extent. So there are basically two different ways. There are zoning, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then there are subdivision and land development ordinance documents called SAUDOs. And in those documents, they may not prohibit solar projects. So it's important to understand. A municipality cannot say, we don't want any solar projects in our township. Also, there are comprehensive plans that townships and counties should develop, and they could guide solar projects. They're not regulatory, so they don't have any teeth to them, but communities can use those to guide development. Unfortunately, very few municipalities in Pennsylvania regulate utility scale solar. It's a fairly new phenomenon, and we found that many places just don't have that regulatory in place. So this is one reason why we were inspired to develop this document. We would like you to look at your township or your municipality, see what that township or municipality has in terms of solar regulation, and contact your township, and hopefully you can have some input, because it's important that community members try to show an interest and concern so development is done correctly. Otherwise, developers might move in and they might just hand a sample ordinance over to the township and say, well, just use this one, it works pretty well. So we're really hoping that the communities will have some input in this. Okay, next slide. So in Pennsylvania, there are 68% of municipalities that have zoning, and that gives them solar options, solar development options. So one example would be having solar development as a special exception in the municipality. And if that occurs, then the zoning hearing board will decide if the application meets the zoning requirements. And again, there can be hearings with community input. A slightly different twist is what's called conditional use. And that's when zoning says that township supervisors rule on the application. The process works pretty much the same as a special exception, but the supervisors make the decision. And again, we would hope there would be hearings with community input. And then the third situation is permitted by right. And that's where a municipality has taken their zoning map and they've actually designated an overlay, and they say this is an area where solar or wind can go in, and it would be appropriate as long as the developer meets the regulations. And I'll show that to you in the next slide. So here's an example of Luzerne County, Butler Township. This is their zoning district map, and every color that you see represents a different series of uses that's allowed in each district. So you see it looks pretty complicated. So it takes the entire zoning document to explain what all those uses are. And it's a pretty technical document, but certainly something that we should all look at for each of our municipalities. So Butler Township did develop an overlay. You can't see it very well in this picture, but if we go to the next slide, down below where that red arrow is an area designated as an overlay for solar and wind projects. And so that would be quite likely permitted by right or special exception. And as long as the developer meets the requirements, then they would be allowed to develop in that certain area. Okay, next slide. Unfortunately, though, there are about 32% of municipalities in Pennsylvania without zoning, and that's mostly in the rural areas. And solar regulations are more limited in these municipalities. For example, they can't regulate the location at all. So the developer can put in these projects as long as he meets any ordinances. And sometimes the ordinance is in the subdivision and land development ordinance, or sometimes it's approved as a standalone ordinance. But they usually don't have as much teeth to them as a zoning ordinance would. Okay, next slide. In addition to the municipalities, Pennsylvania DEP has regulatory authority to regulate utility scale solar projects. And they get that authority under the Clean Water Act through stormwater management. And that's pre-construction as well as post-construction runoff. Now, fortunately, solar doesn't produce a lot of pollution directly. So it's mainly in the road building and the construction of the project that DEP can regulate. So for one thing that they require is an erosion and sedimentation plan that's filed with the Conservation District. And then the second thing is called, the kind of a long name, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES permit. And this permit varies in its technical ability, really, because if you're a township or if the project is proposed for an exceptional value or high quality watershed, Then the developer has to come up with an individual NPDES permit, and that's quite rigorous and pretty detailed. If you aren't in a high value or exceptional value, then there's a general NPDES permit that is required, and that's not as rigorous as the first one, because the first one, the individual permit, they're not allowed to degrade the water quality. Whereas unfortunately, in the other type of watersheds, they are allowed to. Now, one part of this, which is very important, is called the PNDI Environmental Review, and that uses the Pennsylvania Natural Diversity Index. And that's composed of 5 organizations that work together. And I show their symbols at the bottom. DCNR. DCNR would comment on the proposed project and indicate if there are any plants, protected plants that might be impacted. The Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission looks at impacts to fish, reptiles and amphibians, and water quality. The Game Commission would look at impacts to birds and mammals. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service deals with threatened or endangered species that are on the endangered species list. And Western Pennsylvania Conservancy works with all these agencies with their biologists. And then another government agency in Pennsylvania is the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office. They review the plans to see if there are any impacts to historic sites or archaeological areas that need to be protected. Okay, next slide, please. In addition to the regulatory authority, DEP also has a fact sheet of recommendations. And much like what Judy mentioned earlier, try to minimize earth disturbance and grading activities, try to protect drainage features, the natural vegetation, preserve and restore natural vegetative cover, so they would require native species. Existing slopes should ideally be 10% or less, because that would reduce stormwater runoff. Avoiding compaction of soil, which ties in with road construction. And again, try to minimize or prevent increased stormwater runoff. Next slide, please. In addition to DEP, we have some other recommendations in the document. We would suggest that the developer should notify the municipality within 30 days after they apply to PJM. Otherwise, the township is not going to know at all until they're approached with an application. We also suggest that the township states that no logging, site prep, or construction be allowed until the application is approved. And that would include the building permit from the municipality and the NPDES permit from Pennsylvania DEP. As part of their application, we would like to see a narrative that would include the project overview with the site maps, the location, the area covered by the solar panels and the infrastructure, the generating capacity, approximate number of panels, basically a detailed explanation of the project, and especially if any additional transmission infrastructure is required. Also, it's important, we think, to have a quantitative analysis of the expected positive impacts to carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, while at the same time taking really great care to reduce the negative impacts from clear cutting and to analyze what negative impacts there are from manufacturing the solar panels, transporting them, on-site construction, and so forth. Next slide. A few more recommendations. We think that the community would benefit if property owners are notified that live within 2,500 feet of the project. We think, again, there should be a detailed site plan, not just the sketch plan, but something detailed. That sensitive habitats and conservation areas should be inventoried, included in the plan. And then there's a document such as called the Environmental Stewardship Plan. And we feel that should be a comprehensive document looking at the impacts to the environment. And that could include pre-construction surveys of breeding and wintering birds in the proposed project area. Another document that's very helpful to understand the impact is called a risk assessment. And these documents should be paid by the developer, but they should be independent consultants. And then through that risk assessment, the consultants could determine expected wildlife mortalities during construction and operation, and they could plan for monitoring the mortalities that would occur. And then on a different aspect, we also suggest that a property value impact study be undertaken, again, an independent consultant paid by a developer, and they would estimate the pre-project value of the real estate market to determine if property values are reduced by a solar project going in. And then as part of the ordinance, there could also be a real property value protection agreement that's secured by a bond where the developer would need to cover any projected loss in property values. All right, I'm going to turn the rest of this over to Tom Kuehl.
Okay, thanks, team. Other items to be included in a utility scale solar ordinance. The group has already covered many of the items on here. I just want to segue into my bullets with a short story. If you were on early, you heard me talking about golden eagles and the Allegheny Front Hawk Watch. Got to go back to the late 1990s when my wife Janet and I first visited the Allegheny Front Hawk Watch, and we quickly became avid hawk watchers. And of course, we became members of the Allegheny Plateau Audubon Society. A couple of years forward of happy hawk watching, and in June of 2007, Janet and I received an email from chapter leaders Tom and Sally Dick. Tom and Sally had already been working for months to keep proposed industrial wind turbines from being placed on the Allegheny Front in a location both north and south of the Hawk Watch. Their email made several points on why this proposed development should be opposed, and the email was a call for action to request that DEP hold a public hearing. For me, that was an abrupt introduction to the risks associated with industrial renewable energy development, and unfortunately a stark reality that corporate landowners and energy development companies are willing to build installations that are so obviously not properly sited, in this case on forested ridge and plateau habitats. The permitting process and the fight to oppose development can be a long one. In this case, it was 3 years before the requested local hearing was held in August of 2010. I recall just vaguely now, 12 years later, that I did speak at the hearing, but I clearly remember my lasting memory was heartbreaking and tearful testimony from a young woman who feared the worst for her family and home that was now threatened by industrial development right next to her little piece of paradise on what's called Schaefer Mountain, the local name for the Allegheny Front area there. So the point of my story is that people matter and community matter. And from that mindset, we have included protections for people and community in our recommendations for what municipalities need to include in an industrial solar ordinance. Next slide, Sue. So here are some of the listed items. And of course, some of these are, there's further detail in the appendices on these items. As mentioned earlier, many municipalities have comprehensive plans. So let's encourage them to include assurances that will require development to be consistent with the goals and objectives in those plans. Traffic, economic development, maintain and enhance property values, public safety, and let's protect the character of the community and its recreational and historical assets. Put yourself up top on that ridge top at the Allegheny Front and look down in that valley. These are view sheds. communities should look to protect these special assets. Laura mentioned this a bit. Let's bring some transparency to the process and working with the developers when they have to present a description, detailed narrative on their project. Is this a domestic or a foreign corporation? Who's going to be the customer of the electricity to be generated? All of these are things that we think the municipality should be concerned about and the people in the community should know about when such a big impact project is going into their municipality. Next slide. Again, many of these items were covered. Yes, this is a very onerous process on the developer to get all these consulting reports done and reporting back to the municipality in the permitting process. Although they seem onerous, many of them, as was explained, are required by regulatory agencies that are involved in the permitting process in Pennsylvania. Next slide. Management of financial risk to the municipality. With so much land required for industrial solar development, the expectation, as we discussed earlier, can be expected to occur in rural municipalities who are likely to have small budgets, limited or no staff to deal with the heavy time and the financial burdens related to managing a proposed industrial solar development. Liability insurance, decommissioning plans, all of these things are expected things and to be included in the ordinance. But we also include items and we ask the municipalities to pay specific attention to providing some relief from the costs and the time and effort into going through the application process on an industrial development location. Let's charge for fees, let's charge for when their staff has to be involved in the process. Next slide. Again, things that are routinely expected, maintenance reports, requirements to keep the operation, the solar operation in good working order. The periodic reporting to be done at the developer's expense. New permitting being required if there is significant change in the size or scope of the project. And a key point that we recommend in the document to include is annual or appropriate periodic re-permitting requirements. For example, if suddenly the installation is in violation, its noise limits as required at the property line are exceeding the limit, it can be much easier to just not reissue a permit on an annual basis rather than going in a drawn-out battle with a well-funded developer to try to protect the municipality and its residents who are being harmed by that violation. So I guess just a quick closing here is that in Pennsylvania, you know, we've had a history, unfortunately, of habitat destruction, environmental damage from our logging, coal, oil, and gas industries. Let's learn from the mistakes of the past and insist on appropriately sited solar development and encourage it to be done in a low impact way. Next slide. Okay. Sue, take it over.
All right. Yeah. If anybody has any questions, I'm going to check the chat box now, and you could please turn on your video if you want and your audio. Okay, Yeah, someone just put in there, feel free to put any comments here. And recommendations are great.
If
Oh,
I,
Sue. Will they be so onerous to the developers that they will fight them through courts? Perhaps Laura would want to answer that. Laura has a lot of experience with Save Our Allegheny Ridges. That's why I'm turning this question over to her.
Thanks, Sue. I'll just speak from my experience. I've read this numerous times that solar developers actually want to work with the township that already has an ordinance in place because that gives them structure and they know what they're dealing with. It's not an unknown entity. But yes, if the restrictions are terribly onerous, the developer could certainly sue the township. There's nothing to prevent them from doing that. Again, based on many, many years of experience working with townships and industrial wind development, there have been several cases where developers did sue the township. And in every case that I'm aware of, except one, the townships won. So I think the townships have a pretty good track record. And the way to get around that is if the developer threatens a lawsuit and the township is afraid or doesn't have the budget to respond to a lawsuit, they can, first of all, change the ordinance. They have the right to do that. Secondly, they can issue a variance. And so they can say, okay, well, in your case, we're not going to require such and such. We'll give you variance. So there are different ways that a township can handle the threat of a lawsuit. I hope that helps.
Oh, Ally, you have a question if you want to unmute.
Yeah, I have a couple comments. I think this was really great. I actually wanted to mention that DCNR came out with a grid scale solar guidance document for siting, planning, and maintaining grid scale solar. And so it covered, it can be a resource in addition to this information. It has a lot of the same information in it, but it can be very useful. I wasn't sure if everybody was aware of the largest grid scale solar permitted location is actually in the Poconos. And I'll put it in the chat here, but it's near, how do I say it wrong? Kalahari. They're proposing a large scale or grid scale solar, and it's already been permitted. So I put it in the chat. And then a couple other little things. So I thought that maybe environmental justice is something that could be mentioned. So areas, you know, DEP has a whole office dedicated to environmental justice, and looking at what communities that grid scale solar is, you know, being put into and who might be exposed to it. So rural areas might be considered environmental justice communities, and our new governor Shapiro has shown to really be an advocate for environmental justice areas. So I think that's something that we could consider talking about in this document. DEP has a mapping system for environmental justice areas. They are updating it currently, so you can actually see where environmental justice communities are. And it just is about, you know, affecting people disproportionately, and how it's historically been a problem. So a lot of departments are required through an executive order from Governor Wolf to create environmental justice strategic plans. So DEP is required to do that, DCNR, Department of Health, and there's others listed. So it's something that's really gaining traction and needs to be considered. So I'd be happy to talk about that on a separate time with anybody. And I just want to say I'm glad that decommissioning was mentioned. I think that's very important. So I'm glad that was brought up. And you know, maybe coming up with a strategic plan that if like recommendations of where to put, if anywhere had to be used for grid scale solar, where would we recommend it? I know like we have general areas, like abandoned mine lands. I think that's good to kind of identify which priority abandoned mine lands might be things that we want to consider, but that's just my notes on that. So good job overall, though. I really enjoyed this, so thank you.
Yeah. Leah, I'd like to make a comment, or Susan, I'd like to make a comment. With the DCNR guidance document, we actually got involved in the meetings for planning that document, so we were able to have some inputs. And yeah, I think that's something that we can add to our guidance document, because it fortunately came out after we wrote the document. The other thing about environmental justice is one of the problems with solar, utility scale solar in rural areas, it also kind of tears the community apart. A lot of times they'll approach farmers, and unfortunately, because of the financial situation farmers are in, a lot of them will be happy to rent their land to the developer. And then on the other side, you have neighbors that are going to be surrounded by solar panels, or people that don't want their view shed destroyed. So with environmental justice, it kind of floats both ways and out in the rural areas. But that's a very good comment. Thank you.
And then Brian, you had a comment or question?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank our three presenters and everyone else that was involved. This was an awful lot of work and just a really great presentation. Glad it was recorded. We could always go back and review it. And now I have a better sense of what's in the document. So again, just an excellent job. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Lee?
Yeah, I don't know how to do the digital hand, so I put my real hand up. I was going to ask Ally, I know that there's a project that was proposed in Monroe County. Is that in the Poconos? Is that the utility scale solar project that you're talking about?
I was trying to see what county it was in, and I am not 100% sure, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
put
that
it in
is
the
that
chat.
project.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
And-
we're
and-
familiar with that, Ally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, that is one, if it's the one that Penn Future has some legal
Yes,
challenges
it is.
to,
Mhm.
it shows the kind of vigilance, I have often said that when we talk about clean energy, it sounds like all clean energy is good, but you do need to be vigilant. I like Ally's proposal about, let's identify the places where these facilities can be put with and really encouraged. But you can't stop a private developer unless you have these ordinances and other kinds of checks in place. But Penn Future is mounted a legal challenge to this one in Monroe County. They were going to take down close to 500 acres of mature forest. And it was on one of the high quality streams. It was on an embankment. And it would, really negatively impact the water quality in that stream. So I think that there's some kind of stay at this point, but it also shows you that some of our environmental partners are concerned. We need renewable energy. We need this kind of fossil-free sources of power. And I was also going to indicate in some other meetings that I've been involved with. And it's different. It's not utility scale per se, but I often share. I live, a mile from the border of the city of Philadelphia, and our chapter includes much of Philadelphia. And if you go down on SEPTA, you go through miles and miles of row houses, flat roofs. And I've often thought, if we're talking about environmental justice, why aren't we? And many of these are under-resourced, communities, neighborhoods. Let's put solar panels all over the place on those roofs. Let's make sure those homes are insulated. Let's make sure the folks that live in those homes get some benefit for their electrical sources of electricity, and that the rest is put into the grid for the broader community. That's a great place to put solar without interrupting or disrupting any natural habitats. That's Lee is just sitting on a soapbox and spinning stuff. I know it's a lot more complicated than that, but I always shake my head going down on the train into Center City and just see there's a great spot for solar panels.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to your suggestion too, Ally, about coming up with some places where we think solar would be suitable. And I think that's a great suggestion, but we don't have the expertise, I feel, to do that because we don't know the confidential information about wildlife, what the Fish and Boat Commission knows, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. A lot of that wildlife impacts is confidential. So we don't really have that. There is a tool that we could use called the Opportunity Conservation Explorer tool, which I've used. But, that's a very complex situation if you're trying to find a good place for solar and you don't know all the details of the water quality or you don't know all the wildlife impacts. So I would hesitate to be too specific about that. But I would love to see that. And actually the Nature Conservancy has been working on GIS mapping to identify places for renewable energy development in the Midwest. And I heard that they're going to start looking at Pennsylvania and some of the Northeast states. So I would feel a lot more comfortable with the Nature Conservancy coming out with some locations than just our little group. But yes, that would
Absolutely.
be-
And maybe
yeah.
Mid-Atlantic Audubon. I mean, I don't know, but they might be interested in kind of having a comment here. I would hope, but I totally understand where you're coming from. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bill Whitmer says, my soapbox goes like this. We should focus on distributed solar and geothermal, not on industrial scale projects that benefit utility companies and developers. And you know what? I'll bet you everybody on this presentation 100% agrees with you. But we know those developers are coming in, so we got to be prepared for them.
That's right.
Yeah.
I would also like to note that New Jersey I don't know if everybody knows this, but warehouses are required to be solar ready starting on July 1st, 2022, that if warehouses are developed in New Jersey, they have to be required to be solar ready. And I know California also has some regulations around that as well. So it's just something interesting that, we can think about in Pennsylvania. And also community solar. I know that there are some issues with that in Pennsylvania. So something to also consider in the future as well.
Yeah, I think the issue with community solar is the Pennsylvania legislature never let it get anywhere. Like I was spouting off about the Fix Harrisburg project that Fair Districts PA is. The way the system is set up, a perfectly reasonable bill can be proposed and it'll sit in committee because 1 out of 3 people who are higher up in the legislature doesn't want to see it come forward. There might be something going on next year, what with the House of Representatives being kept. So that would be a start.
Yeah, and I just think that we should keep an eye out for any bills along those lines so we can support them, because you're right, that has been the case, but maybe we have a chance now.
I just would like to add something there. Community solar is a good idea, but there are problems with the legislation that's been introduced so far. And just like we're talking about utility scale solar, there's no guidelines at all as to where to site this. I mean, these are smaller pieces than utility scale solar. It's usually up to, I guess, about 5 megawatts, and utility scale goes up much higher than that. But one of the things in the law, in the proposed legislation, for example, you can't own adjacent tracts. One person can't own them, but there's nothing to prevent from adjacent tracts being involved in one big project. It might have a different owner for each tract, but then you get to the point where you're talking about utility scale. So with community solar, it's very important that we need to look at where it's being sited, and if possible, where you want to site it is as close to the community as possible. You don't want to site it far away, and you want to look at the places in the community, parking lots, industrial sites, rooftops, say the local mall rooftops. Something else I want to add about the warehouses. It's a problem with warehouses and with a lot of companies right now. They're looking at going 100% renewable. So, for example, one particular company is Amazon. What they're doing is they're developing forested land in it's up near that project that we showed in the in the PowerPoint. I think it's somewhere up near Keating, Pennsylvania. And rather than putting solar on all their warehouses that they're building all over the place, they're going to cut down forests to put in a solar array. So that's, and there's other companies as well as municipalities that are doing that. There's Philadelphia, unfortunately, is doing that. They're putting up a 400 some acre project in Adams County, in rural Adams County, and none of the guidelines that we talked about, none of these things are adhered to. So that's, anyway, that's my little soapbox about community solar and other issues.
I have one question actually for everybody that's on the call and on the webinar, is that this document and what the team has done really suggests that there's an important role for chapters in terms of looking at their local communities. I know, I wish I had time to go look for that hermit warbler in Delaware County, Philadelphia. I didn't, involved with other stuff, but this takes a kind of a special approach to be, thinking about what's going on in your community. We know, I think Laura worked with South Mountain with a project that was being proposed in Adams County. I think with Greater Wyoming Valley, there was a project that was being proposed that there was some work with. I know there was one could have been Lebanon County, where Quittapahilla was located. The chapter was not involved, but the municipality did not allow the permit because of the high quality agricultural land it was proposed on. So, some of this is taking place with or without chapter involvement, but I guess what we're suggesting here, as I read it with the council, is that there would need to be an active role of chapters when proposals come up in your chapter territory or in your vicinity. Is that realistic, or is that something like, that's not anything our chapter is going to do? I'm curious.
Lee, I personally say that's something we Appalachian Audubon would like to do. We're not currently doing. I think we'd want guidance on where to kind of watch. I mean, we have a lot of municipalities within our chapter region. So, I think some guidance on kind of how to keep tabs on everything would be very helpful.
Good.
One thing that could be a little bit more straightforward would be an ask for the chapters to at least check with some of their municipalities where there is a lot of farmland and forest, and make a list of those municipalities and if they have zoning and if they have a solar ordinance, because so few municipalities do in Pennsylvania. And again, that would take time and effort, but it'd be kind of a straightforward ask, or a matter of possibly checking the website of the municipality to see if they have a solar ordinance. It'd be helpful to know which ones already have some.
That's a great suggestion. And I think that's reasonable and actionable. And so I think that's a good ask.
Okay.
Yeah, my guess is that there are a lot of chapters who don't realize what kind of role they might be able to play, and with the proper education about guidelines and things like that, they might be willing to really jump in there.
Let me ask a question to Laura about wind projects. let's say a municipality already has an ordinance in place. If they were given further information, do many municipalities change those ordinances over the time? That is maybe to make them more environmentally friendly, or does that generally not happen?
It's a struggle. And with some municipalities that already had an ordinance, it took a lot, maybe a year and a half of going to their monthly meetings and asking them to make changes. And some of them do, and some of them don't. So it's disappointing because I'm not the one from that township, but there are residents from that township that are going to the meeting and making the ask. And the supervisors will not cooperate or work with them. But in other ones, they will. So it's a hit or miss, really. But it's certainly worth the effort.
Yeah, that's the reason I asked is this is we might be able to do a survey of the municipalities in the areas covered by our chapters, but how do we know if those ordinances are good or not?
Yeah, we'd have to review them.
That'd be a lot of work.
Mhm.
Can I don't know, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if I can share my screen, but I can share with you an ordinance from Lycoming County. It was adopted by our county government. In Lycoming County, county zoning covers about half of the 52 municipalities in the rural areas. Most of the municipalities have their own zoning ordinance. So the county zoning ordinance only applies to the municipalities that don't have their own zoning and that have adopted that. And I was looking at the site criteria, and if I can show you, probably looks like I can right now. Here are the, can you see that? This is just one piece of our local ordinance, and I'd be interested in knowing what you think of these site criteria. You can see the solar array locations, and particularly the agricultural lands, 50% class 1, 2, and 3 soils. It is permitted by right in agricultural districts. In resource protection zones or areas, it's permitted by a special exception. So if you look down here at 4 in a resource protection area, which we have a lot of forested land in northern Lycoming County, they do have some criteria here for cutting mature trees. This is pretty bare bones compared to the document that you put together. But I'm curious, I know, in just looking at that, what your reaction is to that.
What's the SCF development area? Do you know, Bruce?
I think it's, let me see if I can, what do they call that? There's a whole section on decommissioning. Solar energy facilities.
Oh, okay. So specifically solar.
Yeah.
If you
This
could
was- This
send
was
that.
an ordinance that was adopted in, county zoning was adopted in Lycoming County back in the late 80s. And this ordinance was adopted within the last couple of years as an addendum to the county zoning ordinance.
Well, I can see the slope. It says slopes in excess of 15%. DEP requests, 10%.
Okay.
There would be a difference.
Yeah.
Within that.
I mean, one of the thoughts that I have in terms of this is, if the goal is to get municipalities to adopt good ordinances, then most of the township supervisors in our area anyway they're going to need something short and simple in terms of a model that they could use. And so if we want local chapters to be involved, my suggestion would be that we develop something that is short and sweet, that can say, these are 10 key elements that you should have in your local ordinance if you want to meaningfully regulate the placement of solar facilities in your municipality. most of the township supervisors that I know in our area, if we shared with them the document that you have put together, they would just be overwhelmed. And so that would be, you know, if we're talking about local chapter, and I think that's probably true for local chapters too. You know, if we can boil down all the hard work you did into, say, you know, a kind of primer, that might be a way to involve local chapters and local municipalities in being more proactive instead of reactive to this.
But Bruce, can you send that? I think the last slide has the council Gmail.
Yep, I'll tell you what, I'll just put this in the chat, the ordinance. I can send a link to it.
That sounds good.
Yep.
I have another question for Laura regarding your suggestion. Aren't most of these ordinances reviewed by the municipality's lawyer and not really the supervisors, that they would really do the comb through these ordinances? Or
Yeah, now in some cases that's not true, but in my experience, I'd say 95% of the cases, the supervisors just hand the issue over to their solicitor. And the solicitor, the lawyer, usually looks around local areas, adjacent municipalities, asks for copies of local ordinances that already exist, let's say for solar. And then they just copy and paste and create their own ordinance from other existing ordinances. That's the way the game is played for the most part. Not always the case, but in my experience, that's what happens. So I like your idea, Bruce, though, to have kind of a template of 10 or 15 key things that a resident could go to a township meeting and give to a supervisor that they could share with their solicitor. Because that's usually what happens. The supervisors take it, they pass it over to the solicitor. Very few supervisors, I hate to be negative, but most supervisors in my area are more interested in road crews and maintaining the roads in the township.
yeah,
You know, the roadmasters. Now, I do live in an area that doesn't have zoning, so I don't have as much experience with townships with zoning. So I know there is a difference when you're looking at urban areas, but yeah, mostly the supervisors just hand it over either to the planner. They might have hired a planner to develop an ordinance, or a solicitor. But still, that could help a solicitor if the township supervisors could look at one sheet of paper and say, oh yeah, that sounds good, that sounds good, that sounds good. You know, at least that would be a fighting chance to get the solicitor to include that in an ordinance. So I think
This might be a place where an organization like We Can Serve PA, where they do have a lot of model ordinances on different areas. I do not know if they have something for, utility scale solar, but we should check that. But a great suggestion, Bruce, and maybe some kind of a checklist to how to analyze your local municipality if they have an ordinance or a saldo, that there's a way to assess how effective it is.
One other thought that maybe we shouldn't neglect is I don't know, in your counties, if you have county planning departments. But I know the municipalities often in our area rely on our county planning department for guidance on a variety of subdivision zoning, land development issues. And it's, in Lycoming County, we have 52 municipalities. So for our chapter to work with 52 municipalities, that's just that's not going to happen.
Right.
But if you can get the county to kind of be forward thinking about it, they can maybe encourage the municipalities through their other contacts to at least consider adopting something.
Yeah.
or maybe
I know one of our next thoughts, I'm sorry, Susan, I was just going to say that, we're doing this presentation to the family, to the Audubon network of chapter leaders that were interested in this topic. But, taking the feedback that we get, hopefully there'll be other audiences, maybe partners to present this with to different audiences, municipalities. I know Susan has already suggested that we do a presentation maybe to those communities that have environmental advisory councils, or to those communities that have Pennsylvania bird towns, that they have a municipal focus, and it may be useful to do a variation of this presentation getting the feedback you have, or asking chapters to take, this as something as a roadshow to the municipalities in your area. Just a thought, nothing's in concrete, but great way to disseminate it.
Well, I have a question for Bruce. Do you think it'd be useful to have, like, at the very beginning of our guidebook, maybe just like a summary of the 10 important points right at the beginning?
I think the first thing is to get them to buy in, and maybe not necessarily as a summary, but maybe even as a separate thing, because if you give them that whole guidebook, the 50-page document, even if it's right at the beginning, they may just, the township supervisors that I know might just look at that and say, you got to be kidding me. 50 pages of this, I don't know. So I'm not sure that it would be helpful as a kind of abstract at the beginning. More, I think, would be the first step is just to get them to buy into the importance of having something like this, and something short and sweet that gets them to see how this can help them is, I think, what they'll be they're going to want to know what's in this for us.
Well, I would just add that the two things don't have to be mutually exclusive.
Right.
In other words, you can have that that kind of brief summary in either as an appendix or as an introduction, and it can be lifted out of there, with the with a link to the whole document, so that it can be used as you're saying, Bruce. You just get people's buy-in, and then they have a path to get the full Megillah.
Let me check the chat here. We got several comments yet. We got that there. Also, maybe just a decision tree would be helpful for choosing where to put grid scale solar. And they like the idea about the 10 key things here. And there's the Lycoming County zoning ordinance link there. Lisa says we need to educate our elected officials because they have the final say. We need the simplest list of solutions to work with. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Here's something.
I also put a link in the chat, which is to the We Can Serve PA conservation tools. They have some model solar and wind ordinances. I didn't go through them. I just looked it up.
Okay.
Excellent. Susan, do you know how to save the chat?
Yeah, well, I should say when I'm running a straight Zoom meeting, it's automatically saved.
It's
So I'm
saved.
hoping that it'll be automatically saved in this case because you hit the record button.
Yeah, from your mouth to God's ear.
I want to make a comment. Oops.
If you look down in the lower right-hand corner, there's 3 dots for the chat. And it
I
says
just
save.
saved it.
It
Yeah.
says save chat.
Oh,
just
I hit 'em.
did.
Okay,
Can
Let
you
me
do
know if
that,
you need it.
Susan?
I got that. I hit it. Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, Susan, I'd like to make a comment also. One thing to consider is that not all the municipalities are going to be right for utility scale solar. Particularly some of the municipalities that are forested areas, some of the farm areas too. But unfortunately, this is where developers want to go. They don't want to put them on parking lots or built rooftops. They want to look at what's simple and easy, and that's really where the struggle is going to be. Is changing this conversation. And one situation where we were involved. This is in Adams County. We, along with National Audubon, actually gave some testimony at the hearings, and we were talking about pollinator planting and vegetation around the panels, but the energy company had come in like 3 or 4 years before any of this happened, and they started getting all these leases of land, and one of the leased properties belonged to one of the, I think, the county or the township officials. And he introduced a zoning bill for solar. And this was very detailed. It wasn't just, one short and sweet, but it was very detailed with everything that the developer wanted. Everything for them just to go in and clear cut and just put in all these solar panels. I think they had something like 23 different properties, each, of 100 acres or more that they were putting together. So that's, I just wanted to let you know that that's what happens in these kind of situations where there are no ordinances.
Yeah, Susan, I know our time is getting, toward the end, stay on if there's more conversation. I know a few people have dropped off, but, right now we're in a transition to a new, governor. I know that people like Ezra Thrush are in the transition group for, Josh Shapiro's environmental agenda. And I am wondering if there is some opportunity for us to provide some input. Ezra's been very involved with that Monroe County project because of he's with Penn Future, and they're taking one there. But I think that in terms of the positive steps that where we do need renewable energy, I think working with the Nature Conservancy or other entities to create a map of, hey, build your utility scale solar here, that we really need something like that. There's some other good takeaways from this session, but I didn't want to prematurely preclude things, but I know there's a lot of good feedback tonight.
Yeah. Any other comments here? I think that's it.
Yeah.
Hey, were we going to send out a link to a copy of this recording in the chat to everybody who was?
I think we can, to our constant contact drummer list. I think that would be useful. I think the other thing is to keep in mind, some of you have already registered for the January 3rd work session council meeting, where we want to look at education and outreach statements. We're not going to have the full group of statements, but they're 2-page documents. There will certainly be some related to tonight's program or related renewable topics. And we really want to get feedback before we kind of put these together for the next congressional session, the 118th session, 2 years, and then also for the next 2-year session of the Pennsylvania legislature. So, invite that kind of feedback that's related to this. Not all of the documents or the what we're calling education and outreach statements are going to have the backing of a gigantic paper like this Renewable Energy Committee produced, which is a remarkable 2-year effort. But what we need is real, chapter feedback and buy-in to adopt these positions as kind of our way to work. And the way they're structured is, ideas for the working at the local level, chapters and individuals, ways to work at the, as a chapter with municipalities, and ways to work at the state and federal level. So it's not a cookbook, but there's some nice recipes here. So that's my final bit. Hope you'll get involved with the January 3rd session as well, right after the holiday. Good way to first day of the 118th Congress. That we're good.
I think we're good.
Yeah, thank you everybody for.
I think the committee-
Thank you very much, guys.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Lots of
Thank
good
you all.
stuff to
Thank
work
you
with.
all. Appreciate.
Thanks. Have a good night.